So today I'm going to start with Chapter 9 of The Black Death at the Golden Gate. Chapter 9 is entitled An Impossible Task. The breakdown started as soon as Kenyon boarded the train heading west. Joseph White, the man who replaced him, found his calls unreturned by city officials and responded for funding and responsible for funding, the cleanup of the California delegation that had been agreed to in Washington. State health officials who had been placed under White's command began finding novel excuses to disobey orders, going so far as to claim that removing furniture from a building suspected of housing a plague victim was against city regulations. The Chinese Six Companies meanwhile dodged all efforts to bring in independent physicians to examine residents of Chinatown, though it had promised the Marine Hospital Service its full cooperation if Kenyon was removed from his post. Every morning, White requested that the organization identify all sick residents of Chinatown for inspection by a doctor employed by his agency. The district's population of 15,000 would result in a sick state of about 150 patients per day under ordinary circumstances. White estimated. Instead, the six companies pointed him to only 2 or 3 residents with minor illnesses, a gesture that White took as a greater insult than an outright denial of his request. Though he had just taken command on Angel Island, White was rapidly losing hope. It was now clear to him that Kenyon, while a constant source of irritation to the Surgeon General and hated by everyone in power in San Francisco, had been the only person standing in the way of chaos. Wyman, sensing that the situation was rapidly deteriorating, assured White in a telegram that he would soon have reinforcements. He was assembling a team of the best officers in the service, he promised, and they would arrive by the end of the month. Yet White believed that even with an infinite number of doctors at his disposal, the problem would not change. The gulf between the Chinese and white health officers was too large, with too much distrust on both sides to ever be breached. I yesterday inspected rooms in the cellars of some of the worst districts which I do not believe to have been entered before by any white man in many months, and some of these rooms, partially underground and separated from either street or alley by flanking rooms on either side, are absolutely devoid of light and ventilation, are filthy beyond anything that may be imagined by the Caucasian mind, and filled with a stifling odor suggesting months of opium smoking, with occasional urination upon the floors. I can best describe it by saying that it is the accentuated odor of a rat den. Wyman wrote this in a letter to Wyman admitting he was overwhelmed by the amount of work that needed to be done. This letter, being only one for the information of the Bureau, I shall speak quite plainly about this matter, both as to inspection and disinfection, and say that from present appearances, the thorough cleansing of Chinatown appears to be a lost physical impossibility, and that I am certain of the absolute dishonesty of the Chinese in their promises that they have made, and well satisfied that they will fulfill nothing that they can possibly avoid. I shall in this instance, as I have ever done, perform the duties assigned to me to the best of my ability, but feel that it is only justice, not only to myself, but to the service, to say that I do not feel hopeful regarding the results. Wyman alerted White in the following days that he would soon have a deputy by the name of Rupert Blue, a 32-year-old physician in the Marine Hospital Service who was en route from Milwaukee. White did not know it, but Blue was neither Wyman's first or second choice to fill the role. Wyman had to select him only after other candidates had threatened to leave the service rather than take on the impossible task. For Blue, the move would amount to something of a return voyage. He had worked in San Francisco briefly as a quarantine officer 5 years earlier, and had more familiarity with the city and its intricacies than most men in the service. Despite that experience, Blue carried a reputation for laziness that was soon reached by White and sourced him on a man he had never personally met. Already feeling like he was leading a losing war, White wrote a blunt letter to Wyman suggesting that Blue be replaced before he set foot in San Francisco. The difficulties here are so great that never before in our history has there been a greater need for tactful and forceful officers, and mediocrity is, I think, clean out of place, he wrote. I learn that Blue has no tact and is inert beside. I do not know Blue and have not a reason under heaven to dislike him, so there is nothing personal in this matter at all, but I am fully persuaded that he cannot take the lead in this matter now or in the future. For all of his life, Rupert Blue had shouldered the weight of not meeting other people's expectations. The sixth of 8 siblings, Blue was born on May 30th, 1868, into a prominent Southern family still adrift 3 years after the end of the Civil War. His father, John Kilcrest Blue, had been a member of the North Carolina delegation that voted to secede from the Union, and then served as a colonel in the Confederate Army, fighting alongside Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia until the surrender at Appomattox. When Rupert was 3, the family moved to Marion, South Carolina in order to be closer to the home of Rupert's mother, Annie Maria Evans, whose family included past governors of the state. Thanks to their influence, the Blues were given a second start. John Gilchrist Blue settled his family into a 300-acre plantation he named Bluefields and opened a law practice. Before long, he was elected to the South Carolina state legislature, which made him one of the most recognizable people in Marion. Rupert grew up in a small town, in a town small enough that everyone knew who his parents were, and in a family prominent enough that any misstep would be recounted in each one's stately Greek Revival mansions that line Marion streets. A natural introvert with a slight stammer. I can relate to that. He retreated from the watchful eyes of his neighbors and into the open expanses of the plantation, where, along with his siblings, he would sneak into the fields early in the morning and burst open melons with his fists before devouring them bare-handed. Though physically strong, growing to stand above 6 feet tall with a wide boxer's build that he would put to use in the ring in later life, Rupert could more often than not be found holed up alone with a book. The boy feasted on history, devouring any account of ancient Rome he could get his hands on, and soon developed a lifelong fascination with the military campaigns of Napoleon. Those reading sessions were as close as he would come to military service, however, and he chose to stand in the shadows as his older brother, Victor, took up a family tradition that included a grandfather who had served as a colonel in the War of 1812, and great-grandfathers who had fought on opposing sides in the Revolutionary War. It was soon clear that Victor was everything Rupert was not. Though only 2 years apart, the boys seemed cut from different stone. Where Victor was outgoing, Rupert retreated. Where Rupert was a great listener, Victor was bombastic, expecting that his natural charm would smooth over any wrinkles that life threw at him. Victor soon became the family paragon, and entirely worthy of the great love of his parents, brothers, and sisters. Rupert is very different, his sister Lily Kate once wrote. He just cannot stand on the street corner and give the glad hand to someone he might have gone to school with. Victor's decision to enter the military not only brought him closer to his father, cementing his status as the favorite son. Rupert, indifferent to the pageantry of rank in the service, searched for another way to make his mark. He found it in the rapidly professionalizing world of medicine. The nation was growing and industrializing, and a new class of doctor was needed to care for it. Smart young men were filling the halls of hundreds of medical schools sprouting up across the country, drawn as much by the prospect of opening a lucrative private practice as by the promise of healing the sick. While the students received some exposure to the new sciences of bacteriology and immunology, most were content to become what was then known as a commercial physician, their degree essentially functioning as a pass that allowed them to set up a small general practice and be their own boss. The boomtown nature of the field was naturally brought uneven results. These enterprises, for the most part they can be called schools or institutions only by courtesy, were frequently set up regardless of opportunity or need, in small towns as readily as in large, and at times almost in the heart of the wilderness, noted The Atlantic in a 1910 article about the transformation of medical education then happening in America. Nothing was really essential but professors. Little or no investment was therefore involved. A hall could be cheaply rented, and rude benches were inexpensive. Janitor service was unknown, and it is even relatively rare. Occasional dissections in time supplied a skeleton, in whole or in part, and a box of odd bones. Other equipment there was practically none. Rupert enrolled in a small medical school in Latta, South Carolina, studying what was then known as practical pharmacy. Despite a distance of just 11 miles from Marion, a length he could walk in a day if it came to it, he was painfully homesick, spending solitary nights in his boarding house room dreaming of the comfortable confines of Bluefields. He attempted to show a brave face to his family, unwilling to fall short once again after the standard that Victor had set. Thanks to a nature that is cosmopolitan, I am content to live anywhere, he wrote in a letter full of bluster of a young man away from home for the first time. That Christmas, his father suffered a heart attack brought on by years of heavy tobacco use and the lingering damage from a childhood bout of rheumatic fever. Rupert rushed home to be at his side and remained there until he died on January 6, 1889. His death changed something in Rupert, then just 21 years old. His mother had 2 older unmarried sisters left with few resources and little income. He realized that there was no longer any place for boyhood. He vowed to provide for them as well as possible in ways that Victor, whose military service flung him around the world, could not. Rupert entered the University of Virginia at Charlottesville determined to become a higher caliber of doctor, capable of commanding both money and respect. He willed himself to compete, wringing out the last of his retiring nature and replacing it with a sense of purpose that had long been lacking. He masked his newfound determination under the facade of a polite Southern gentleman, though his letters home left little doubt as to his new life's direction. "I will not assimilate the vices of others," he wrote to his sister Kate. "If I am spared to good health, I can accomplish something, for I have the will and the ambition." Money remained so tight that in his letters home he crammed as many words onto a single sheet of paper as he could, not only filling the margins but sometimes flipping it sideways and continuing to write letters lengthwise until no blank spot was left. His lack of funds made courting a woman an impossibility, an embarrassment that he tried to hide from wealthier classmates. When fellow students assumed that a photo of his sister Kate hanging in his room was a girlfriend, Rupert readily went along with the ruse until sophisticated-eyed Joe Guthrie detected the resemblance and gave away the deception, he wrote in a letter home. After 2 years, he moved farther north to Baltimore to enroll at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, the first public medical school in the country and one of the few that he could afford. Never a prodigy, Rupert got through the demanding program by grit alone, holing up in his room with wads of tobacco and devoting every moment to mastering the material. "I am working like a Trojan," he wrote in a letter home. "There is so much to learn." In those lonely hours of study, Rupert slowly developed an ambition to become something greater than the common physician he had first imagined himself, focused more on the bottom line than on his patient's health. He had willed himself to get through medical school, and he did not want to feel that effort was wasted. Victor was rising through the ranks of the military, and Rupert was determined not to be left behind again. The day after his graduation, he wrote a letter to Kate in which he spelled out the kind of doctor he hoped to be. "I begin my professional career today with perfect cognizance of the many responsibilities that rest upon my shoulders. When I listened to the valedictory address, I mentally determined that I should never be found on the side of the right, let the consequences be as they may." He soon found a venue that supplied not only a way to provide for his family, but the excitement that he had longed for as a boy. Upon graduation, he applied to the Marine Hospital Service, thrilled at the prospect of traveling to exotic locations and treating illnesses that he had only read about. Infectious disease is one of the few genuine adventures left in the world, Hans Zissner wrote later in his influential Rats, Lice, and History, a 1935 tract which described the state of the medical profession around the turn of the 20th century. The dragons are all dead, and the lance grows rusty in the chimney corner. Wars are exercises in ballistics, chemistry, ingenuity, administration, hard physical labor, and long-distance mass murder. However secure and well-regulated civilized life may become, bacteria, protozoa, viruses, infected fleas, lice, ticks, mosquitoes, and bedbugs will always lurk in the shadows, ready to pounce when neglect, poverty, famine, or war lets down the defenses. Like Victor, Rupert was ready to travel the world and serve his country. Unlike his brother, however, Rupert's purpose was to heal rather than to hurt. He soon learned that he was one of only 4 candidates to gain acceptance into the service that year. He received an annual salary of $1,800, equivalent to roughly $50,000 in today's dollars, and began sending a hefty portion of every paycheck home to his mother and sisters. As he donned his dark gray service uniform for the first time, he saw in his reflection the man he had always wanted to be. One of his first postings sent him to investigate an outbreak of yellow fever in Galveston, Texas. The bustling coastal city sat on an island jutting into the Gulf of Mexico, separated from the mainland by a short bridge that connected the Texas of sagebrush and cowboys with the wider modern world. Over 45 steamship lines provided direct connections to destinations ranging from New York to Europe, funneling people and goods into the busiest cotton port in the nation. Electric streetcars ran down its broad streets, passing ornate mansions. A jumble of nationalities and languages enlivened its stores and restaurants, creating a society so cosmopolitan that the New York Herald dubbed the city New York on the Gulf. It took weeks for Rupert to acclimate to the fast pace of the West, so different from the cotton fields of home. Yet he soon found a welcome diversion. A young actress by the name of Juliet Downs, the daughter of a prominent railroad executive who looked past Rupert's lack of money and devotion to his work and saw a life of adventure traveling the globe alongside him. The pair wed in 1895, and not long afterward left for a posting in San Francisco, where they settled into a barrack on Angel Island. A winter rainstorm turned half of the island into mud, prompting Rupert to put Juliet in a hotel in the city while he roughed it alone. For the first time in what would soon become a pattern in his life, he found his mind torn between his professional duty and concern about his young wife's increasing unhappiness as she faced the realities of a serviceman's life, for which she was still ill-prepared. His supervisors at Angel Island noticed that Blue's attention often seemed to be elsewhere. While he demonstrated diligence and tact on the job, he was still somewhat disposed to be hurried, noted an officer in an early job evaluation. Rupert was next transferred to Portland, Oregon, where, to bring in extra money, he took a side job as an associate editor of the Medical Sentinel, a publication that billed itself as the local journal of the doctors of the Northwest Pacific. But even with a second source of income, there was never enough cash at the end of the day. The pressure of supporting Juliet's taste while also sending money home to his sisters and mother weighed heavily on his mind. "Ask Mother if she can get along until May 30th or June 1st without remittance," he wrote his sister Kate on yellow letterhead. "I promised Victor to send funds right away to her, but my finances are exceedingly low." Only after a few years in the service did he finally get an opportunity for adventure. In 1900, Rupert received an order to report to Rome, where he would be in charge of an investigation into rumors that plague was spreading through rural Italy. He jumped at the chance, undaunted by an assignment that could put him on the front lines of an epidemic. Juliet, meanwhile, could barely suppress her excitement at finally traveling to Europe, describing it in such alluring detail that her mother announced that she would be coming too. After searching the Italian countryside for evidence of the disease without result, Rupert spent his days strolling through Rome, drinking in its history. He paced along cobblestones that were older than any building he had seen back home, and watched the sunset dance along the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. Through her family connections, Juliet secured a private audience with Pope Leo VIII. Rupert was not quite sure of what to do with himself while in the man's presence, being neither Catholic nor understanding the French and Italian words the Pope spoke. Yet he finally was calmed by the Pope's touch, a reminder of the fatherly affection that he was too proud to admit he missed. I teased Juliet by saying that he liked me best as he took my head and face in his hands twice, blessing first, benediction last, and only conferred this favor upon her once, he wrote in a letter home. I believe he has blessed Mother in her faraway home, and for that he has quite won me. The couple spent weeks touring Europe, giving Rupert his first taste of life outside the United States. They visited London and Scotland, and then arrived in Paris, where they were among the 50 million visitors to the World's Fair, delighting in a demonstration of the first ever talking film. Just as he began to feel comfortable abroad, Rupert was ordered to Milwaukee, where he would be put in charge of monitoring illnesses among the shipping fleet on the Great Lakes. The return to the demanding reality of the Marine Hospital Service made the summer seem a dream. Money was still too tight, the Milwaukee winter too dreary. By the time Rupert and Juliet boarded the train to San Francisco the following year, his new assignment, combating plague, their marriage was showing deep cracks. As the couple sped toward California, Rupert looked forward to the chance to start again. White put him to work as soon as he reached the city, giving him day-to-day charge of the sanitation campaign in Chinatown, which allowed White more time to devise ways to pressure the Chinese Six companies into revealing the plague victims he was certain were hiding in the district, rendering the cleanup efforts useless. Unable to find allies on the State Board of Health, White turned to the police department, asking officers to alert him if they came across any Chinese who appeared ill during their periodic raids of Chinatown's gambling halls. When that proved unsuccessful, White asked Secret Service agents to trail Chinese residents in hopes that one would lead them to an infected family member. He then posted agents at the ferry building, aiming to stop the flow of infected Chinese that he believed were being ferried across the bay to Oakland. You cannot form any idea in Washington of the difficulties, White complained in a letter to Wyman. With White's attention elsewhere, Blue was free to explore Chinatown at his own pace. He was impossible to miss as he roamed through the district, with his black hair, blue eyes, and brawny build towering over nearly everyone he passed. While he kept one eye out for areas that cleanup crews needed to address, he spent the majority of his time making idle conversation with Chinese residents, a little hungry, I guess. The first time that an officer in the Marine Hospital Service had attempted to forge a personal connection. His genial nature seemed to broadcast the sense that he was trustworthy, and he soon opened doors that had long been closed to other white doctors. In his first week, he discovered cellars filled with years of accumulated sewage and the decaying bodies of rats. While investigating an alley behind an upscale store on DuPont Street, he came upon more than 150 pounds of rotting meat lying in the open, overrun by the squirming bodies of rats and swarmed by insects. White soon found himself drawn to a man who was so easy to like. Blue's work to date has been most excellent, he wrote in a letter to Wyman, apologizing for his previous harsh assessment of the man. The impression that he was not a man of pronounced personality and executive ability, although a very nice gentleman, is utterly erroneous. He has entangled a good many rather difficult snarls, has an immense amount of self-possession and good temper, and is altogether fully capable of acting as executive officer. White quickly realized that in Blue he had found a man who could deflect Governor Gage from undermining the Marine Hospital Service's mission. When the governor once again threatened to end the sanitation efforts in Chinatown, White sent Blue to meet with him. After one lunch, the governor came away mollified, as Blue promised that Gage could send a doctor of his choosing to attend the autopsy of any suspected plague victim conducted by federal agents. In San Francisco, Blue finally found work that gave him a sense of purpose beyond a diversion from his crumbling marriage. Juliet, too, found reason to like the city outside her husband's company. While Rupert waded through Chinatown's filth, She attended formal teas given in her honor at the mansions of San Francisco's high society. Her father's wealth and prominence as a railroad executive, her ticket into the city's social elite. Mrs. Rupert Blue, what a beauty she is, noted the gossip column of the San Francisco Call. After she was feted by more than 50 attendees at the Pacific Heights home of Mrs. Linda Bryan, then known as the Grand Matron of San Francisco society. By June, Blue was promoted. Freeing the city from plague had become a futile task in White's view, and he simply did not have the patience to preside over a long, slow defeat. He sent Wyman a telegram requesting a transfer and suggested that the Surgeon General appoint Blue in his place. Blue took over without ceremony, shouldering the twin responsibilities of sanitizing Chinatown and searching for additional plague victims. Over the following weeks, he began putting his finger on the service, shaping it to fit not only his own personality, but his conception of what a doctor should be. Unlike Kenyon, who was most comfortable in a laboratory removed from the complexities of human interaction, Blue thrived in situations where trust and tact were essential. That was not the only difference between the two men. Kenyon paid an almost fanatical attention to rules, a natural trait of a man whose genius lay in following the complex procedures by the science of bacteriology. Blue, whose academic work had been average at best, proved more willing to look at problems from multiple angles, searching for anything that might work, however unorthodox it might be. One of his first moves after assuming command was to lease a small office in an alley off Chinatown's Portsmouth Square. There, in a 2-room space that cost $75 a month, he set up a makeshift laboratory and morgue, finally providing the Marine Hospital Service with an outpost in Chinatown itself, rather than the distant Angel Island. Then, to solve the issue of bodies disappearing from the district before they could be examined, he convinced Wyman to allot him $35 a month to spend on establishing his own hearse service. He soon had a driver who could be sent with a horse and a cart to any building in Chinatown as soon as the body was reported. The cadaver would be transported back to Blue's new laboratory, where it could be examined before anyone had a chance to hide it. When state health officials protested, Blue revealed that underneath his genial nature lay a defiant streak. Unafraid of the repercussions of going against his promise to the governor, he issued a blanket ban that excluded state health officials from autopsies conducted on Marine Hospital Service grounds, and instated a rule that no one except for federal health officers could enter the facility without his approval. Blue dismissed complaints by state doctors, writing in a private letter to Wyman that, "We can bear a great deal more for the good of the service and the cause." His first real test came one evening in early July. As Blue and his fellow officers were concluding an autopsy in the small lab off Portsmouth Square, relieved by the absence of obvious plague bacilli in the body, they received a tip of a possible outbreak at the Yoshiwara House, a brothel at 845 Washington Street in Chinatown. 3 of the 7 prostitutes working at the establishment had developed large, painful buboes on their groins 6 days earlier and now lay nearly comatose with fever. The women had all lived in the city for about a year, making it impossible for them to have brought the disease with them. When Blue arrived, police officers were encircling the house, forming a quarantine line, fearful of what the officers would do. A 24-year-old prostitute by the name of Fukiyanaki, who had yet to develop any symptoms of the disease, managed to slip away and flee to a house at 526 Pine Street, where she remained in hiding. Blue and his officers pushed into the building and began evaluating the women, all of whom appeared near death. A bacteriologist drew blood samples from each woman and conducted a field test known as an agglutination reaction, which, though not as conclusive as Kenyon's preferred method of animal inoculation, had been used with some success in India as a rapid method of determining whether plague was likely. The result was immediate and characteristic, Blue wrote, noting that he was absolutely certain the 3 suffered from the same disease, and this disease was bubonic plague. There was nothing the doctors could do to save the lives of its victims. T. Shina Takagi, a 23-year-old, and Mio Akiya, a 26-year-old, both died around 3 in the morning on July 9th. Their bodies were taken to the Marine Hospital Service morgue. Federal doctors, clad in rubber aprons, conducted autopsies and took tissue samples from the buboes swelling on their legs. Cultures soon confirmed the presence of plague. Blue wired the coded message, "Bumpkin Malleate," to Wyman in Washington, informing him that 2 more verified cases were at hand. He sent another coded message 2 days later after Fukiyanaki, the woman who had escaped quarantine of the brothel, was found dead despite having received a dose of Hafkeen serum from a Western doctor who treated her while in hiding. An autopsy revealed plague and syphilis. Federal doctors continued to monitor the remaining women in the brothel, expecting that they too would develop signs of the disease and die. Instead, health officials watched in amazement as Umi Kawamura, a 22-year-old who was among the 3 initial cases, slowly began to recover, becoming the first patient followed by Marine Hospital Service doctors to survive the disease. None of the other women in the building contracted plague, their lives untouched as if the disease had been satiated and lost interest. As evidence piled up that plague was still in Chinatown, Blue felt himself getting boxed in. He had no appetite for trying to institute another broad quarantine, and little reason to expect Wyman would support him even if he wanted to. With the situation more dangerous than anything Kenyon had experienced, Blue realized how little official power he actually had. Marine Hospital Service officers learned that the 3 prostitutes who had died from plague had collectively had sex with at least 50 men, including several who lived outside Chinatown in the days prior to their buboes appearing, expanding the zone of potential victims beyond the bay. Local newspapers, meanwhile, refused to give any attention to the latest outbreak, preserving the false sense of security that blanketed the city and left it all the more at risk. Even if the disease spread to white neighborhoods, neither residents nor their doctors knew what signs to look for, prolonging time before federal doctors could come in and prevent a plague from finding its next victim. Blue continued to work in the shadows, hoping that luck would finally turn his way. He and his men injected themselves regularly with doses of Hafkeen serum, leaving them swaying between bouts of feverish delirium as they tried to solve a puzzle that could save countless lives. When no new cases were discovered in the following weeks, Blue began to question whether the Chinese were becoming increasingly skilled at hiding bodies, or if there was another force at work preventing the plague from exploding into the general population. The city's newspapers had lost interest in the Marine Hospital Service's efforts to fight the disease following Kenyon's transfer, giving Blue the room to work out a solution away from the spotlight. Still, he could not help but worry that once again he would fail to measure up to standard and spent longer and longer hours in his small office in Chinatown while his relationship with Juliet withered. His childhood insecurities rushed back that August when Victor arrived in San Francisco on a transport ship from the Philippines. Of all the heroes with the late war with Spain, there is none that made a better record than Blue, and none that wears his hard-won honors more modestly, wrote the San Francisco Call, a paper that had yet to mention Rupert's work in the city. When Rupert met Victor at the docks, his brother seemed to forget who he was, sending Rupert into deeper chasms of self-doubt. Victor later blamed his memory failure on the affliction that he called Philippinitis. When my brother met me this afternoon, it was only when I heard somebody say, "That's Rupert Blue. He used to be the quarantine officer," that I remembered his name, Victor said to a reporter, adding that about a dozen soldiers on the ship home suffered from similar bouts of memory loss. Rupert entertained Victor and his wife for several days before they continued on to the East Coast, his damaged pride never recovering until Victor's train had receded from view. The plague's apparent summer lull was broken just before Labor Day. The body of Li Mon Chow, a 40-year-old man who was discovered one morning in the Oso cigar factory at 618 DuPont Street. The corpse was carted to Blue's morgue, where an autopsy revealed plague festering in the man's groin and right armpit. The roughly dozen men who worked alongside him vanished out of fear that they would be placed under quarantine or jailed, leaving Blue with no information about where the man had lived, whether he had any family, or where he might have traveled recently. Anything, in short, that could help him save another person's life. He had little time to investigate. Days after Lee's death, Juliet's father, P.L. Downs, was riding in a first-class car when his train derailed and burst into flames in Montana, killing him and 30 others on board. Blue was granted an immediate leave from his post and took Juliet's hand as they boarded the next train north. Over the course of the 3-day journey, Blue could only look back over the last months of his life with regret. His affable nature had helped smooth tensions between the Marine Hospital Service and the enemies Kenyon had made, but he could not point to any real progress. People were still dying, plague was still spreading, and he was no closer to a solution. He knew that this was the greatest test he had yet faced, and his best and perhaps only chance to accomplish something that could only rival the achievements of his brother, whose fame had only grown. As he looked out upon the Pacific, he vowed to himself that he would not fail.